how when did you find out that you want to be a science fiction writer?
Well, I think I'd take that right back. I mean, I was born in 1955, so I grew up in this. I sort of, became a teenager in the 70s, and in the 70s, I discovered my father had a shelf of science fiction novels, and I just devoured those, And I think that was when I first. Well, I became aware of the possibilities of science fiction. Let's put it that way, yeah. And at that point, when I was still at school, I wrote some science fiction stories. I don't think any of them were very good, but they were. So from quite an early stage, I've always just wanted to be a writer, full stop. So I never saw myself as just a science fiction writer. As a point of fact, almost everything I have written has ended up being science fiction. I just enjoy the potential possibilities that the genre offers me, really.
Yeah.
Mm.
When was your first stories? When did you write those?
My first stories were published in the 80s, the early 80s, in the British science fiction magazine Interzone.
Yes,
it's still going. It's always struggling a bit, but it keeps going under various editors. And back in the day, it was a really great resource for a new writer, because they took ages to get back to you. But when they did get back to you, they had a whole page of feedback, So even if it was a rejection, you kind of you thought you got something from them, And that was great, And once I got a few stories in there, I thought it sort of makes you feel, okay, I'm a writer, People will pay me to read my stuff. Not very much, but they will pay me to read my stuff. And so that was my first rung on the ladder to being a writer, really. Yeah.
I managed to get and read your one of your first short stories, The Welfare Man. But I think
yeah.
That's sort of yourself. Maybe you should tell a little bit about your background, why a story called The Welfare Man has something to do with you.
Yes, I wrote two stories, one called The Welfare Man and one called The Welfare Man Retired. And I also wrote a novel called Marcher, which incorporated those stories and other similar stories. And so I was, for most of my life, I've been either a social worker or a manager of social workers or a social work educator. So I've been very much in the welfare field. And there's the welfare system is always a double-edged sword. It's like, one hand it's to help people, on the other hand it's to control people. And I was very aware of that when I was working in the system, and that's why I wrote that story, to portray the ostensibly benign but nevertheless quite controlling aspects of the welfare system. So that was the idea of that story. It probably feels a bit dated now in many ways, but
yes, I think that it maybe Brexit hadn't happened, and so, but there was some.
There's quite a lot of things about the world situation that looks very out of date, I think. But I stand by the story itself. But all the detail was very out of date. There's a lot of things. It's funny. There's certain kinds of things you can predict, and certain kinds of things that you can't predict. I mean, who predicted the Berlin Wall was going to come down when it did, for example? Or that South Africa was, going to overthrow apartheid. None of that was obvious, was it, in the, say, the 70s? And suddenly it happens.
Yes. Yes, and then stories become outdated.
Those aspects of stories very quickly become outdated.
But I think there's still some interesting. Maybe we should just talk about that now also. But I think. One thing that strikes me with the stories is that your characters are very believable.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yes. Well, I think it matters. I mean, I think it's. I think it matters to me that I think my stories, I try to make them psychologically real. Within my limits of my skill, so that. So I'm not very interested in just kind of cardboard cutout characters. I mean, some people say some of my characters may seem to them like cardboard cutouts, but in my own mind, they feel like people with proper motives and so forth. And that's the kind of science fiction I like. I'm not terribly fond of science fiction that's the characters are just kind of what you call it, one-dimensional, you know.
Yeah, then the old pulp stories that were
Pulp stories, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not very fond of. I mean, yeah, there is a place for that, and you know, occasionally those could be fun, can't they? There are some stories where, to be honest, the characters just don't matter very much because they're just not the point of the story, and that's fine. But to me, I usually, I always try and make the characters come alive as much as I can.
So, we just improvise here, but I think. But what about the new wave science fiction? That was before your time, or did you somehow drop into that?
Well, I was aware of the new wave. That was because that was in the 70s, wasn't it? The new wave, in the late 60s, early 70s, and so I was kind of aware of it. But I think the science fiction that most influenced me, and still to in my mind, you know, I'm a bit like us old guys, you know, we still listen to the music we listened in the 70s, not the music that's around now. And I'm a bit like that with science fiction as well. You know, that the science fiction that I read in the 70s is still, to me, the archetypal science fiction. You know, and so it wasn't really the new wave that influenced me. Apart from, I suppose, would Ballard be described as a new wave science fiction writer?
Yes, I think so.
Ballard I admire very much, so in that case he'll be the exception. But and particularly recently, I feel I've become a bit more aware of Ballard and a bit more interested in his stuff. But the books that I mean, I remember the key science fiction novels for me as a teenager that I read, and I still think are great, are the Space Merchants, for one. You know the Space Merchants?
I know about it. I don't think I ever read it.
Well, I'll recommend it. Paul and Kornbluth. It's very funny. It's very funny. It's written.
I have a copy of it, I think.
Definitely read it. It's funny. I mean, some of it is outrageously outdated, you know, but the general idea of a world gradually that's being ruled by increasingly powerful advertising agencies still has a certain resonance, you know. I'm trying to think what other ones. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Heinlein. There were certain classic novels that I read then that have remained, even in a way, templates for me. I can't say either of those novels actually had particularly rounded characters, though, but
No.
they had other qualities. They had
that was why I mentioned New Wave, because that was one of the things that they tried to make better characters.
Yeah, to make the characters more interesting. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's funny actually. Quite a lot of the novelists I admire, they aren't actually particularly strong on character. You know, Ballard, for example, he's strong on psychology, but I wouldn't say he's strong on character. So it's interesting. I have to think about that.
Yes. Well, let's jump a bit forward. I'm not sure. Oh, that has a page. I'll just see if I can remove that stupid background here.
The Nightmare Before Christmas. The background is, I think, yeah.
Yes, I don't know. Background and effects. Nothing. None.
There you go.
Yes. Okay, so now
I assumed you were sitting in front of a backdrop. I didn't realize it was a fake background. Or perhaps this is a fake background, a fake office or something.
Yeah, I think maybe you can see some of the people.
Oh, right. Hello. Hi. Hi.
Okay. Yes. Good. But I was trying to show this is an issue of Interzone. I think that was one that has 3 of your stories in it.
Yeah, it was a special me issue. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, I enjoyed that. That was yes, I'm trying to remember what's the name. Yeah, there was a I'm trying to remember which stories were in it now, but the cover.
Hobby Fields was one of them.
Hobby Fields, yeah.
Yes, because it's I think maybe our theme this year is portal fiction.
Yes.
And I think it's I don't know if you recall details from the story, but
I do. Yeah. No, it's definitely a portal story. It's about a young woman falling through from a parallel world into our world. Yes. Yeah. And I wrote several stories in that theme. And the young woman she was called Tammy Pendant. She became a character she had a story of her own later on, which was just called Tammy Pendant, which was considered so outrageous that it resulted in Asimov's magazine being banned from libraries in one American state. I can't remember which state it was now.
Because of one of your stories.
Yeah, because of Tammy Pendant. Because Tammy Pendant was a young teenager sexually promiscuous young teenager who took drugs, and that was considered way out for was it Minnesota or one of those places, you know?
The two other stories of it's Greenland and Red Island. Then we are into some what can we say, more modern stories about the environment and stuff. And the breakdown of everything.
Yeah, well, Rat Island was a kind of global, climate change kind of story in a way, wasn't it? It's about the term Rat Island was a kind of metaphor for the way that a population of rats on an island can grow and grow and grow, and everything seems fine, and then suddenly one day they wake up and there's no food at all, you know. And that was the metaphor behind that story. And then the other story was
metaphor for how we treat our planet as the Red Island.
Exactly, very much so. And Greenland was another portal story, actually. That was a story, or a teleporting story. Yeah, I mean, any teleportation is a kind of portal, isn't it? And it was a portal story, but it was also one of those portals that involves splitting the individual into two, you know. So it was about a character that, in order to get some money, allowed a version of himself to be teleported to a space station and used for medical experiments. One of my darkest stories, to be honest.
Let's take one more from one of the magazines here. I have an Asimov here. This is Stephen Baxter's. That was in the series there that started with the Earth that drowned or some waters. Now I can't recall the name of it. But your story in this is Peacock Cloak.
Oh, yes.
Your name is down there, but not the title of the story. So that's an entirely different thing again, or maybe.
Peacock Cloak. I'm very fond of the Peacock Cloak. I had a sort of period when I was regularly getting stories in Asimov's, and Peacock Cloak was it was about a constructed world, you know, a virtual world inside a computer, basically. But the whole story was set in this virtual world at the point where it's gradually about to disintegrate. It's a very odd story, but it was one of those stories where I just let it rip a bit and just allowed my imagination to have its head and just see where it went, you know.
Also really psychological. You're not sure what happened between those two characters that in some way is the same character and not the same character.
That's right. There were two versions of the same person, but had been through a whole lot of different things, so he felt like a different character. And he'd, in order to make this world work, he'd made lots of kind of quite serious moral compromises. And then he was confronted with a more unaltered version of his original self. and he felt very challenged by that and very defensive, and he felt he had to justify everything he'd done. And I suppose it was a bit like if your young self could be introduced to your old self, and was required to your old self was required to justify
like in some time travel stories also.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a bit like that, except they were both the same age. Story. Yeah. I was very pleased with that story, actually. But that was a bit of a one-off, I think, for me. That was
so it was also the title of one of your collections of short stories, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. My second collection.
Yeah.
It was the title of the selection. It had rather a nice cover, which was designed. The peacock cloak, for some reason, was translated into Russian in a Russian magazine.
Okay.
And the artist did a rather good picture, and I thought, I want that picture for a book cover. So I basically decided to call the book Peacock Cloak. And then we asked the artist, who was, a Russian fellow in Moscow, if we could use the picture.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So the main character wore a magical peacock cloak, basically.
Yeah.
And,
but let's back up a bit. Let's see, maybe. I think maybe the most successful book was Dark Eden, wasn't it?
Dark Eden is by far my most successful book.
It started with a short story.
It did start well. Yeah, it started with a short story entitled "The Circle of Stones." Actually,
Okay.
There is a short story called Dark Eden, but prequel to the novel. The Circle of Stones is kind of a very early version of the novel itself, And Dark Eden is my most successful novel because it won the Arthur C. Clarke Award, which was obviously a great honor, but in a more practical sense, it also meant lots of people bought my book, and I ended up writing 2 sequels to Dark Eden. Do you want me to talk about Dark Eden? Just tell you a bit about it, or is that what you're thinking? Or?
Yes, maybe without spoiling too much. I'm not sure everybody has read it. So, but the concept that behind it. Maybe.
Yeah. So I won't give away the story, but so the basic concept behind Dark Eden is, first of all, imagine a rogue planet, which is a planet that has no sun, and when I wrote the novel, believe it or not, I didn't know whether such things really existed. I just thought, I bet they do, and they do. They do. They have been discovered. They're hard to spot, obviously, but they have been discovered. And the science gets a bit more dodgy as we go on, but bear with me. My idea, of course, the planet like that would be completely dark and very cold, but it could still have a hot core, the same as the Earth has a hot core. And my idea was that geothermal life forms had evolved below the surface, and they found a way of moving up to the surface and making the surface warm, and also illuminating the surface. All of which, to my mind, wasn't too implausible when you consider that we do have geothermal life forms here on Earth which don't use the sun for energy, in deep sea vents and so forth, and I believe there are also bacteria living several kilometers deep in the Earth as well. So that was the planet, and then the story was set up in such a way that just 2 people, a man and a woman, got stranded there. But that wasn't the start of the story. The start of the story was 150 years later, and then their descendants, several hundred descendants, were living on that planet, and it was about their society.
So it's also a study of societies.
Yes. Well, I think all the Eden series, which is, apart from being my most successful novel, I think Dark Eden was in many ways my most ambitious novel. I tried to do as much, it's got a large cast of characters, it's got a lot of themes, and I tried to show in my Eden books a society actually evolving over time, how that would happen. And I tried to think about the kind of culture that would develop, including the stories they would tell themselves and so forth. So the
Yeah.
people have a kind of more or less Stone Age type technology. I mean, they are aware that people on Earth had a more advanced technology. But I put it to you and the people in the room, I mean, I know that it's possible metal, and I know it's possible to make aircraft and, you know, television sets and all the rest of it. But if I found myself on an alien planet, would I be able to do any of that? Would anyone to find iron ore, for example? I mean, is that a thing that anyone would know? I wouldn't know. And I wouldn't know what to do with it if I found it, apart from the fact I know you'd have to make it very hot. So my idea was that they would revert to a Stone Age society, but they'd have the one advantage, unlike a real Stone Age society, is they would know that something else was possible. So that would probably speed up their rate of progress somewhat.
Yeah.
Because
So,
I mean, Stone Age people wouldn't be going around thinking, if only we could figure out how to make metal, because they didn't know there was such a thing. So there was that, that difference. So the main thing in the story was a kind of the whole of the community on Eden lived together in one spot. They had a pretty bleak existence, you know, subsistence, hunter-gatherer existence. Many of the people were physically, you know, challenged by birth deformities because of inbreeding and malnutrition. But they all lived together as one family. And then this young man and some of his friends challenged the status quo, and they end up splitting the family in two, and starting a whole new history of Eden begins, because we have two new societies in conflict with each other, and suddenly it becomes more like history on Earth, you know.
Yeah. But you started with only two people, like Eden.
Well, like the original Eden, but that was before the time frame of the novel. The time frame was 150 years later.
Yeah.
So the origin myth of the people on Eden is to do with these two people who are their forebearers of everyone on the planet. So they are terribly inbred, you know. And these two people, Tommy and Angela, there were 5 astronauts who landed on the planet, but the other 3 attempted to get away. They attempted to go back to Earth. Since they never reappeared, we have to assume they didn't make it, you know. But these two thought, well, we may as well stay here. If those guys come back, well and good. And if they don't come back, well, we're still alive, you know, at least we're still alive, you know. And they ended up being the Adam and Eve of the New World, you know. It turned out to be a very badly, it would appear from the stories that they tell in Eden 150 years later that their 2 ancestors were a very ill-matched couple. They didn't get on very well. It was an unhappy partnership. But nevertheless, they're the parents of everybody. Yeah. 2 people, imagine 2 people who would never have got together in real life, find themselves stuck on the planet, you know. Yes. Could work out, but in this case, it sounds like it didn't work out that well.
What about, you said the science was not 100% solid, but how do you handle a science element of science fiction in your stories?
Well, I think probably this is the approach that most science fiction writers take, is try and get some of it right and let the reader indulge me with the rest, you know. So that, for example, I think the biology of a biologist has told me that my life forms I developed for Eden felt quite plausible, you know. So we had essentially the core, if you like, the basic life form in Eden is what they call trees, which is a kind of tree-like thing which draws its energy from underground, basically. And so it has very, very deep roots that pump its sap down underground, a bit like a living geothermal power station, really. Trees are hot. If you go near them, they're hot. And they also have luminous flowers, so that they're a source of light and warmth. And then a whole lot of secondary life forms have evolved. Plants and animal type life forms have evolved. When these trees evolved underground, but they've managed to survive on the surface, they've melted parts of the ice on the surface, and other life forms have evolved in sort of in their shadows, so to speak. You know, rather like on Earth, plants are the primary life form, but animals and so forth depend on plants. You know, and a biologist has told me that's all plausible, but an astronomer told me that you couldn't really imagine a life form that would be able to produce enough heat to keep the surface of the planet warm. You know, so you know. You know, apparently, and that's out by quite a large factor. But you know, I didn't know that, and so I'm guessing many of my readers don't know that.
Yes, yes. Even some of the so-called hard science fiction writers get things wrong in their stories.
They do, yeah, they do. I mean, I think, you know, the biology was reasonably hard science, and I think sometimes when science fiction writers make up animals and plants and things, they go for a kind of assemblage of random weird things. I tried to go for animals that all had some kind of, you could see they had a certain, you know, like animals on Earth, they're built around certain basic body plans, you know, like most vertebrates have got 4 limbs, you know, for example, and 2 eyes and so forth. And I tried to work on certain basic body plans to make it more plausible. But some of the higher ground in Eden is completely dark. So it's only the valleys that have got the trees and the warmth. So the higher ground is completely icy, and certain animals have adapted to be able to cross the ice, and they have luminous. Some of them are luminous sort of bulbs on their heads, and some of them use echolocation and so forth. You know, so I tried to make animals that kind of worked. You know, and I had a lot of fun with that, really. And I think readers enjoy the fact that they kind of work. You know. So that's my approach to science. It's kind of mix and match, mix up a bit of something that seems plausible with something that involves a certain stretch, you know. But not worry too much about it. But you know, the phrase is plausibility. You want surface plausibility. You don't want the reader to think that's ridiculous, you know. But you don't mind if the reader thinks, well, okay, I'll let it go, you know. Because what science fiction novel have you ever read where you haven't had to let something go, you know? Faster than light travel, for example, most science fiction novels make use of, which, as far as we know, is impossible. Yeah.
So when did you find out that it must have a sequel?
Well, I don't know. I wrote it as a freestanding novel, actually, and it has a fairly open-ended ending. But I wrote it that way because I liked it, and I didn't want to carry on writing about the same characters. But I thought, I haven't finished with this world, and so I guess, you know, I just mulled it over in my mind, and eventually I came to the conclusion that I would write 2 more novels, and the 2 sequels are written another century, couple of centuries on from the original Eden book. So the events in the original Eden book are already semi-mythologized. The characters in the original Eden book have become sort of almost mythological characters. We look at the different societies that have grown up since then, and we can see how they eat over the intervening period, you know. Yes, I had a lot of fun developing. Actually, Eden has developed into a number of different societies which are antagonistic towards each other and have different belief systems and different cultures and so forth. That's what I developed for them. Yeah, and then I set different stories in each of them. But you know, there were sort of certain thematic links that are running through the whole thing. And I suppose that there was a sort of emotional flavor to the whole thing, which is to do with a sense of exile or loss, you know, which anyone who's familiar with the biblical story of the Garden of Eden is about exile and loss, you know. So I was channeling the original story in a way. But of course, in the original story, people were exiled from Eden, not to Eden. That's the twist. Yeah.
Yes. I was thinking managed to get some of your books for sale here at Fantasticon, and maybe we can talk a little bit about them.
Okay, yeah.
There's,
So what we got?
there's
Tomorrow, that's the most
definitely
recent book.
Holy Machine. Was that the first published novel?
That's my first published novel,
Yeah.
and if I say it myself, I think it still stands out pretty well. Yeah. What else have you got? You got the Holy Machine. Shall I talk about the Holy Machine a bit? Or?
I have American City.
Oh yeah, American City. That was the first novel I wrote after the Eden books.
Okay.
And you had Tomorrow, I saw.
Yes, and
Tomorrow.
the most recent one.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about those without spoiling too much?
Sure, I won't spoil them at all. So America, sorry, I'll do them in time order. The Holy Machine was my first novel, and I managed to get a publishing contract for that because the Arthur C. Clarke Award wasn't the first prize I won. I also won something called the Edge Hill Prize, which is a British prize for short story collections, for my first short story collection, which was called The Turing Test. And my novel, The Holy Machine, had come out some years before that, but on the basis of that, I was able to get a sort of commercial publication of it, and that's what you're holding up there, kind of new revised edition that came out at that point. And the premise of The Holy Machine is that most of the world has been there's been a massive global reaction against science, modernity, and so forth. Most of the world has been taken over by religious fundamentalists, and only a small part of the world still is occupied. A small part of the world is occupied by refugees from the rest of the world, who are particularly people like scientists and people who are in favor of science and against fundamentalism. And in that context, it describes the relationship between a rather lonely odd man and a sex robot, basically. And I'm not giving very much away when I say he starts to suspect that the sex robot is becoming sentient, and the story unfolds from then on, because he's aware that the policy of the authorities is that all robots, any kind of robot, they're wiped clean every few years to prevent them from developing maladaptive learning in a kind of maladaptive way. And so he's aware that unless he does something about it, this newly sentient being will be wiped clean. And I won't say any more without giving the story away. But I think what I'm quite proud of with that book is I basically wrote the first draft of it in 1994, and finished it in 1997. And what I felt I saw coming was that a lot of people in the world are quite alienated by modernity, quite alienated by scientific modernity, and they feel left out by it, and they feel that things that give their lives meaning are being undermined. And I feel that we have seen, and that this resulted in this wave of fundamentalism, which I called the reaction. And I feel, although it's not exactly taking the form of religious fundamentalism, I do feel we have seen the reaction in the world since then. I feel a wave, for example, in Britain at the time of the Brexit vote, a lot of people were saying they're really fed up with being told what to think by experts. People get fed up with being told that they don't know anything and they should listen to people who look much cleverer than they are. And so I feel I predicted that vibe that was beginning to appear in the world. I think what I was picking up on, in fact, though, was the rise of fundamentalism in the Islamic world, which was more evident then. And I thought to myself at the time, I bet that will spread to other countries as well. And I think in a way it has.
Yeah.
So that was the idea of that book. But so the book, all my books are quite sort of philosophical in a way, as well as I hope the characters are interesting and so on. So that I suppose there was a kind of conflict between science and religion, and a conflict between mind and body, and various things like that I was thinking about in that book. Yeah. But anyway, I'm still proud of that book. So people aren't always proud of their first novels, but I still think it's quite good. And so that's my first novel. And then should we talk about America City?
Yeah, but just we don't have much time left. Maybe we should just jump to you.
Okay, well, I'll just say America City is my climate change novel. It's about politics in North America resulting from climate change. I suspect that may be of more interest to your readers than Tomorrow, which is rather an experimental novel.
Yeah.
I'm very proud of it, but it's not really a science fiction novel. It's a kind of experimental novel, which I hope your readers will try. But as you're a science fiction convention, it's not quite in your bag, you know. But not all most science fiction writers don't only read science fiction. Readers don't only read science fiction. I mean, yeah, I don't want to overstep my time. I can see I've almost run out of time. Yeah. Does any of your audience want to ask me anything at all? Or?
Yeah, maybe we can. I can just cycle this around. And are any of you have any questions? Okay, there was one. Yeah.
I was wondering if science fiction is as popular in England as genres such as historical fiction or horror or fantasy. I know fantasy is very big, but is science fiction also very popular?
I would
compared to other genres.
Yeah,
like crime stories.
I don't know the figures, but I would say crime fiction is much more popular than science fiction in Britain, and I'd say that if you go to science fiction conventions in Britain, the average age is getting quite old now. So I think the written science fiction is somewhat a little bit on the decline in Britain. Of course, science fiction movies are still very popular, aren't they? So I don't know what the figures are.
Yes, this is a strange thing with science fiction movies versus books. It used to be like science fiction movies were very popular, but the books, a lot fewer people knew about those.
Yeah, and I'm afraid movies have now become the dominant form for science fiction, which is a shame in a way, because movies, it can be a bit sort of, boil everything down to just action, can't they? And less interesting in a way than a novel.
No.
But I'd say, yeah, science fiction has become a bit less popular in Britain. I'm sure crime and I wouldn't be surprised if fantasy is much more popular. It's the same in Denmark. Same in Denmark.
Yes, about the same. I think it's very hard to publish science fiction in Denmark. So, but sometimes a writer comes and maybe if they call it something other than science fiction, they can.
Yes, that happens. That happens. It's kind of, it can be annoying when an author who isn't a science fiction writer writes a science fiction novel, and everyone goes, "Wow, that's amazing!"
Yes, it's a future story. It's
what a good idea! Whoever thought of that? And you get that quite a lot. And sometimes they're very good, to be fair. But it just seems like, why do you think that's a new thing? But I mean, I mainly know Denmark for crime fiction. Denmark seems to be very strong on crime fiction. We often get and so on in Britain. Very good.
I hear some of the TV series are very popular in Britain.
Yeah, quite. It's quite dark usually, quite dark. But good. Yeah.
I think I prefer the British TV series.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Danish ones are including with my friends.
Okay. It's more exotic. Is from another country. So.
Well, I suppose there is that, isn't there? Yeah.
But maybe we have 2 minutes or so. We can. Are you working on something right now?
Well, I've not been well recently, and so it's taken a bit of a back burner. But until my latest health crisis, I am slowly developing a new novel, and I won't give too much away. But I'm working on a novel that's to do with the whole generation ship idea.
Okay. So you're back to straight science fiction.
Well, nobody seems to like my experiment in outside. I won't say nobody likes it. Some people like it a lot, but not many people like it.
I also enjoy it. I think Priest also has written some that are a bit far from at least traditional science fiction, and I also like those.
Yes. I think my novel Tomorrow is it's set in an imaginary country, so it's made up in that sense. And I think there's a kind of science fiction sensibility, which as SF reader would recognize. Science fiction, it's just got that, it's science fiction is very much a fiction for people who like ideas, isn't it? And I think it's still got that quality, joy. So but yeah, so this generation ship idea is gradually sort of marinating in my brain, the idea of setting a novel on a generation ship, maybe half a century into its voyage, and the society that's evolved on the ship, So too late to go back to Earth. They're on their way. There'll be several hundred years before they reach their destination.
Did you read Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora?
I haven't. No, it's a generation.
It's a sort of anti-generation ship.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But there's as usual, some very interesting ideas.
Yeah.
So
okay, well, I'm intrigued by the idea of an anti-generation ship. I haven't come across that book.
It shows that many of the ideas that writers have about a science fiction ship don't work in reality. But I think he's cheating a bit. I think maybe if a different kinds of generation ship might have been more successful than the one in his book.
I think again, it's one of those things that if you really do the science, it is very difficult to see how you can make it work. But if it, as a place to set a story, if you allow yourself to just do a bit of hand waving and just this problem has been solved, that problem has been solved, just had to take it, then it starts to be interesting. How would it be to be born on a starship? Even your parents were born on a ship, and you've never seen Earth. You will never see anywhere else except the ship. What kind of life would it be, and what would go on in that world? I think that's quite interesting, and I'm quite intrigued by that. And but I think so a lot of the technical problems, I'm going to just, wave some magic dust over.
Yes, you can do that when you're a writer, and not a scientist.
Not when you're designing a real ship; it wouldn't be so good.
Yes. Okay.
But
I think time is more or less up now. But...
Well, let me just say, first of all, I was very honoured to be invited to Fantasticon, and I'm so sorry I can't be there. I couldn't come; it just wasn't possible. But lovely to be invited, and I hope you're having a lovely time.
Yeah. It's the weather is fine.
Good.
There's a lot of people here, so yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm very social.
Only not so many of them right here. There are also other things going on.
I understand. Yeah.
So,
well, anyway, have a lovely convention, everybody, and
yes, and thank you for joining us on Zoom. Well, I hope you get well soon, and
thank you very much.
Write a lot of books in the future.
Thank you very much. That's great.
Okay. Yeah.
All the best. Nice to meet you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.